All right. Hello, folks. I know I usually come out here and wind up screaming something or horribly just, I guess spiking the stream right at the beginning. Like that's a bit, but I haven't been streaming for a while. I haven't done a sacrifice to the YouTube gods. So welcome to the most recent bit of content from Insurrection with Brenton Lengel, special online edition because deadlines are hard. And I have here with me Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Todd is a wonderful guy. He's debated me and Ben Burgess once, and I've known him, I think since before you or I kind of got any real traction on the YouTube platform. So do you want to introduce yourself, introduce your show?
Yeah. So I'm Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Thank you for the introduction, Brenton. You can follow me at the Praise of Folly YouTube channel. I do regular content on Tuesdays and Thursdays and then every other Saturday. So Tuesdays, I do book readings. Somebody once said, I won't read the books you recommend, but I'll watch you read them. So I'm like, okay. Yeah. We're doing Wars of Rocket right now by Smedley Butler. So that's
a great
book. Thursday, I do what's called a casual stream where it's like whatever I want to talk about with whoever I want to talk about. And Thursday is going to be the idea of eucatastrophe and Watership Down. And then Friday, that's a special episode with Keith Preston where we're going to talk about, is libertarianism even a coherent concept anymore?
Yeah, that should be interesting. Yeah, how is Keith, by the way? I haven't talked to him since our debate.
He's good. He's a regular guest on my roundtable, which is generally current events.
I remember the debate that actually resulted in my absolute favorite comment ever for a debate lineup on Modern Day Debate. It was Brenton looks like the werewolf that owns the local pub.
Wow.
Yeah, that was before I did the Viking haircut. I'm officially into my midlife crisis, except my entire life has been a crisis. So I think since the last time we spoke, I more had like the rudderless hippie thing going on, and I did not have my ears pierced. But once I shaved off like the sides of my head, I was just like, you know what, my ears look a little boring, and went and got some metal shoved through them. And I've been very excited about it. So, and by the way, Todd, you've got like this Prince Kropotkin look to yourself right now.
I've been said I look like Lenin, I look like Ho Chi Minh, and now you said Kropotkin. So yeah. I don't know what that means, Brenton, but
Kropotkin is probably a lot better than Lenin.
The other two, yes.
Yeah. Ho Chi Minh, I have a bit of affection for Ho Chi Minh because if you look at Vietnam, I've often used it as kind of a Marx-Leninism success story in the sense that they managed to avoid a lot of the worst authoritarian things that you saw out of the Bolsheviks. And like during COVID, because they had a socialist economy, they were able to not only shut down effectively during the pandemic, but and keep like deaths to almost a complete minimum. But they also had their economy grow all 4 quarters during, the original COVID shutdown. So if Vietnam's model had been exported to the rest of the world, like we might not have COVID today. Now they still got hit pretty hard by the variants because, it's inevitable. But I think even then their death toll is nowhere near what pretty much any other country on earth is at. And people say like, oh, well, that's just because it's a really small country. It's not. Like Vietnam has 1/3 the population of the United States. So, I am not a Marx-Leninist, because I don't have a stick up my ass, but, game recognizes game. I also do like it because the Vietnamese kind of have an inherently anti-authoritarian culture, and Ho Chi Minh actually originally reached out to the United States for help against the French, but the French were our boys, so then that happened. So Todd, you reached out to me about this, but then I kind of threw things for a loop because there was a bunch of stuff I wanted to talk about. But I listened to your podcast on both Tolkien, one of your Tolkien podcasts, and then also I listened to your bit about why you think wars may be more difficult to sustain going forward into the future. Do you want to you want to repeat some of your arguments from the wars, and then we'll get to Tolkien and magic?
So basically, if we look at the idea, okay, so first of all, the claim is not that that violence goes away, right? You still have things like murders, feuds, homicides, things like that. But what separates now, it's always going to be somewhat arbitrary, where you draw the line between what constitutes war and what doesn't. So if we use the term arbitrarily gang warfare, but that's more of a slang term. I don't really consider that war, because if the Bloods go up against the Crips, that's not nearly the same thing as, like, say, the Germans versus the French, right? Yeah. That's a whole different thing now when we go to that level. So what I'd say is that if we draw the line, it's armies have to be at least a few thousand. And most gang violence never gets that large at all. You don't have thousands of men lighting up and shooting at each other. So as a somewhat, arbitrary, this is where I cut the Gordian knot, say a few thousand soldiers on both sides. Now we have a battle, a real battle, and then a real war could be going on. Now, broadly speaking, there's 4 kinds of wars that can be fought. There's the forever war, which is the U.S. military-industrial complex, constantly needing to have. I mean, if you make money selling weapons, guess what you're going to do? You're going to start wars all over the world to sell those weapons. And then you have large-scale industrial war, which is quite the same thing, but it's a precursor to it. That's number 3. You know, like the American Civil War, World War I. And then you have what we might call large-scale pre-industrial war. We might call that Rome versus Carthage. Mm-hmm. Pretty large armies, hundreds of thousands of men conscripted. And then
the Iliad, the siege of Troy, that kind of thing.
And then small-scale wars. Well, you saw in the Middle Ages, where you had these princes lining up, but they were like really small armies that didn't really amount to much. Now, I would argue, that I believe that due to energy consumption and this concept called EROI, energy return on energy investment, that hydrocarbons, which is the dominant form of energy right now, are approaching the point where they will become an energy sink, which is where the ratio is 1-to-1 or less than 1-to-1, in which case they're no longer a valid energy source. So since there's no alternative on the market yet, and I don't really see one coming up anytime soon, I think that this is going to lead to an energy crisis, which will lead to a collapse of modern industrial civilization. Mm-hmm. For more on that, you can look at John Michael Greer or Joseph Tainer. Now, with that in mind, and we plot this out in the future, what does this mean? Well, it means 2 things. The forever war and industrial wars are going to go away, and they're not ever going to come back, because they could only be possible based on cheap coal for the industrial war in the beginning, and then cheap oil, both of which are going to be gone. Now, will we have large-scale wars like Rome and Carthage? I think that'll be a lot harder, because one of the things that anarchists and libertarians will say is, well, actually, let's go back to René Girard, right? He said that with Christ's sacrifice, however you view that, whether you believe Christ was the Son of God or something else, it changed the Western psyche. So human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, it's just done. We don't do it anymore because it's fundamentally changed our psyche in the West.
Yeah, unless we're Augustus Sol Invictus, but he's just a weirdo. So,
yeah. But then again, so if we have now the other thing then is both libertarians and anarchists and liberals have argued that slavery was like that too. It's something that is just no longer tolerable in the West. If it were to come back in some form, everybody nearby would gang up and destroy that society. It just wouldn't happen. War, conscription is often labeled as slavery. That was the slogan of the anti-war movement, conscription is slavery. So if we telescope this out, could we envision a future in which conscription is as unjustifiable as chattel slavery and human sacrifice? I think we can. And if that's the case, I think large-scale war becomes impossible, because how do you conglomerate all these men to line up and fight each other without using this kind of force if everybody views it as illegitimate?
Yeah, well, I would agree with you on that. And in fact, so have you read Debt, the First 5,000 Years?
Yes. Okay,
excellent. So David Graeber actually kind of goes into this a little bit. One of the things that I found that was really interesting in that book was that the theory that large-scale wars of conquest, particularly, and slavery, were all tied to 2 innovations. The first being the state, which grew out of the ability to have, a settled agriculture, to have a surplus. And then on top of that, what you really needed to have these kinds of like large scale professional wars is you needed currency and you needed slaves. And so, originally, like money emerged. There was monetary practices, but they were much more, I guess what I could say is more ritualistic. Like if you watch Last of the Mohicans, you see the Daniel Day-Lewis character come in, and he's got a belt of wampum, but the wampum, he's not buying anything with it. He is, it's a testament to his lineage. He has this, so he is a Mohican from this particular family. So really, like, a lot of people will say, we need money because barter doesn't work. And yes, barter doesn't work. Barter never worked. No one ever bartered as a system. That is not a thing. What's his face? Oh God, he wrote I know this, but my brain crashed. I think maybe COVID burrowed in there. Or no, actually, I'm just getting worse in my old age. Guy who wrote Wealth of Nations.
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith. Thank you. Jesus. Professional here, people. So Adam Smith famously imagined barter because, he was a city and town dweller. And he was trying to guess at what a pre-money society would look like. And in fact, what wound up happening was that he just was like, okay, well, maybe they just traded stuff. And, I still remember that old, did you ever see this? The old Disney cartoon that they used to do to teach everybody about where money came from? They had like a song, like how many spears for a tiger skin and how many skins for
No, I never saw that.
Yeah. I don't even remember. It was, obviously propaganda, but yeah, it was all centered around Scrooge McDuck and finance and stuff. But yeah, they had a whole thing about how people are singing the song about why they need money. And of course, this was literally just Adam Smith pulling it out of his ass. But because it's intuitive, people, and we didn't have the science of anthropology, people just kind of were like, oh, yeah, sure. We definitely did that. So what Graeber postulates in the book is that human society pre-money was actually knit together by mutual and infinite debt. As in, whatever community you were in debt for the rest of your life to everyone else in that community. And similarly, they were in debt to you. And so, why did you help people? Well, because they were part of your community and you knew that you might need their help in the future. So initially, trade and barter, that was reserved exclusively for strangers or maybe even enemies. It wasn't really until we had the innovation, I'm going to put that in quotes, the innovation of minted silver. In the early on in the Fertile Crescent, the original Sumerian bureaucrats measured taxes in silver. Taxes were not paid in silver. They just used silver as okay, this much wheat, this much barley came in from this person, these many chickens, just to make sure that everybody had paid their taxes. And out of that practice came people minting silver coins, which were then used as a medium of exchange and a store of value. And then what wound up happening there was suddenly you had money you could use to pay professional soldiers. You had your slaves going and mining silver that you minted into coins. You handed it over to professional soldiers. Those soldiers went out, and instead of sacking a town and for plunder, they're paid. And what are they doing while they're sacking that town? Well, they're capturing people to be slaves, to put them into the mines, to mine more silver, to mint more coins, to pay more soldiers. And oh my, I've gone cross-eyed. Here we are in 2024, and Russia has lost. I think at this point, back in August, it was 50,000 KIA. So I am very the idea of large-scale conflict, especially industrial conflict, ending as a result of peak oil is something that I am very partial to. I actually think that is a brilliant insight on your part, because especially if someone is a materialist, they have a materialist understanding of history. When will war stop? Well, it will stop when the material conditions stop incentivizing war. And obviously, if we don't have the oil to fuel our war machines, or if we do have it, but it's too expensive, oftentimes people will figure things out. You guys will remember Bobby from the Mustache Mafia podcast. He's on here a lot, and he's talking about how Clausewitz says is that war is politics by other means. So if war becomes too difficult of a way of actually carrying those politics on, obviously people won't engage in it. And you even kind of hit the nail on the head when you talked about the princes, having these much more small scale conflicts, because, the Middle Ages was a significantly more peaceful era. People were a little bit more afraid of interpersonal violence. But compare that to, under the Roman Empire, far fewer people died in these massive battles. And why was that? Well, when Rome fell, the denarius became worthless. So what are you going to pay these soldiers with to kill people they don't even know? So, yeah, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk with you on this, because I think that is a very salient critique. Now, I've gone on for a little bit, so I'm going to let you respond, and then we will. I'll say something incisive, and everyone will be very impressed with both of us.
So the other thing to say here, Brenton, is so yes, part of the analysis was based on asking the question: what are the material factors that make large-scale industrial war and the forever war possible? Now, then can we imagine a future in which those material factors are gone? And I think, yes, collapse is one way to envision that. But there's another thing, too, though, because the two other forms of war predated this. Large-scale conventional wars like in antiquity, and then smaller-scale wars like in the Middle Ages. The thing is, though, one, if we view... so let's put it this way. If you have like a religion that's dying, so like paganism in the Roman Empire, mm-hmm. There's a certain point at which, for whatever reason, it's just no longer tenable to be pagan anymore. And to even envision going back becomes kind of impossible. And that's a mental change, right? Because the material conditions of Constantine are the same material conditions as Diocletian. So the material conditions, at least in my estimation, were not what was causing this, because they were the same before and after. So it's a mental realization.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to quibble with that just slightly, and I'll tell you why. So one of my tragically unproduced plays is called Berserker. Spelled without the last E, like the actual way, with the KR on the end. Berserker, I have managed to do like a reading of, and after Snow White Zombie #5, and a couple of other campaigns go, I'm probably going to launch Berserker as a graphic novel. Now, this is set, it uses real history. It's set in Iceland in the year 997. And the conflict centers around the real world conflict between the Icelandic pagans and the Christianized Norway. The history of it is King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, who is officially a saint, by the way, probably a sociopath. You will see why as we go forward. He was converted to Christianity, and then he proceeded to use Christianity as a uniting force to conquer the remaining pagans and unite them all under his will. Now, you can say that, as the church came in, paganism, became impossible. I'm somewhat skeptical of that because, of the story of Raud the Strong. So this is key background information for Berserker. In Berserker, it is set up around the King Olaf Tryggvason has dispatched a priest by the name of Thangbrand to Iceland to convert the remaining Norse pagans. Thangbrand being a Saxon priest who spoke, he'd been to Rome, he spoke Latin, but he was basically a thug. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote an awesome poem about him, which is where I found out about him and why I was like, oh shit, okay, I got to tell this story now. But what happened was that under one of these battles, you had Raud the Strong, who was held to be a Gothi. So he was both the political and spiritual leader of a group of Vikings, like in, I think, the Faroe Islands. And so he used his dark magic of sailing against the wind, which was what the Christians considered it at the time. It's really just being good at sailing to escape a battle that he lost. However, Olaf Tryggvason, as soon as the wind changed, chased him down to his stronghold, came in and famously murdered him in one of the worst ways that I can imagine. They fit very metal. They fit a drinking horn like down his throat and took a snake, popped the snake in there, and then like with a red hot poker drove that snake into his stomach, and it ate its way out his guts. Yeah. So as you can see, this is a very intense play of mine. But the fact is that I think with regard to Christianity, the material circumstances that change are in a way ideological, but there seems to be something about monotheism that seems to grant civilizations that embrace it an edge in war compared to polytheistic civilizations, and maybe it's because of the sort of the unifying idea of monotheism, but it would seem to me that like Constantine, it may be that he was genuinely convinced, but also, if you're a leader and you think that a particular ideology is going to get people on board with you, you're going to do it whether you're a believer or not. I mean, perfect example, honestly, would be the Bolsheviks. I was talking to somebody earlier today, and they were talking about how, if only Marx hadn't existed, we would not have had all these tragedies within like the early 20th century. And yeah, I'm not convinced of that. I think that, Lenin still would have been a dissident. The czars executed his brother. If you execute my brother, I'm coming for you. It's one of the things that I actually somewhat admire about Lenin. That you can say a lot about him, but dude got revenge. Yeah, let's say that Marxism doesn't exist. Well, I kind of feel like the British still would have sent Lenin. He still would have been a dissident. He would have just found some other unifying ideology to gather the people together to overthrow the Tsar. Now, would that ideology have been better or worse? I mean, you see Russia now. It's pretty much only bad options these days. So,
well, the point is not to make the point that to argue about idealism or materialism, but the point is this: when you have a closely held belief, and then somebody gives that up, that's usually because something their belief doesn't account for happened, and they can't account for it. So therefore, they then say, well, after this event, whatever that is, I changed my belief. Mm-hmm. And a classic example of this is the conversion from the Roman Empire to Christianity. Mm-hmm. The idea being that for whatever reason, those people who made the conversion, and some of them, of course, did it for self-centered reasons, but that isn't alone going to explain a paradigm shift. There has to be something that is explainable by this new system, right? And it fundamentally changes that person's psyche, and experience. Right? If you go to war, right, and then you kill somebody, you're not the same person afterwards. You've fundamentally changed. Now, part of my theory is this: can we view this as for groups of humans in general? So, can groups of humans have an experience like that, where they can't go back, in the sense that after you've killed someone, you're a different person. You can't go back to who you were before. It's just impossible, right? It's just impossible. You're a different person now.
Yeah.
So could we envision this for a group of people? And if we can, could we envision a scenario in which conscription and these kinds of wars are just unthinkable because enough people have gone through a certain kind of experience? Mm-hmm. And this creates a bottleneck, a genetic bottleneck, because if you don't adopt this new form, you just go extinct. You just die out, right? That's the theory I'm postulating. Yeah. And so those that survive on the other side, there'll be a selection bias, of course. But might that itself be a event that catalyzes the people afterwards and changes them fundamentally? Not perfect them. I'm not saying that, but just like in the same way that killing someone would fundamentally change who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to quibble a little bit just with the idea of who you are being a stable thing. Like, we have this idea that we are the same person for a moment, that there is this continuity. The problem is that both continuity and separation are kind of, in the philosophical sense, and I guess in the real sense, they're mental projections. You can say, take for instance the argument that I've heard about life begins at conception. And I hear that argument a lot, and it is very intuitive, because you see the beginning as in the fertilization of the egg, therefore that is the beginning of the process of life, except actually no, it's not, because what we actually have going back are all of the circumstances that directly led to conception, meaning we could just as easily, for exactly the same amount, it would be less intuitive to people today, we could set it when the parents meet, or when the grandparents meet, or when Confucius has his kid. Because fun fact, by the way, every single person in the world is the direct descendant of Confucius, including you and me. Yes, we're Chinese. No, I will not explain that later. You'll have to come back for more. So I suppose what I'm saying is, with that example, and I apologize for using kind of a more politically charged one, I'm not sure that anyone is ever either not completely changed or exactly the same person from time to time. We never step into the same river. So I like what you're saying, and I think that there probably is a civilizational level change that could occur, which you're postulating. I would caution just a little bit on making too many assumptions as to the idea of a stable personhood, if that makes sense, because you're talking to a Buddhist.
Well, right, but the point that I'm saying is, when you look, obviously people change over time, but the point is this: there are certain choices you can make that preclude you making other choices, or going back to an earlier state, whatever your theory of self is. I think we would agree on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what I'm saying, the real I think leap would be is, and maybe we can invoke Jung here with a collective unconscious or something. Can groups of people have that same experience, or an analogous experience? So rather than an individual making this choice, which both precludes and excludes doing other things, could a group do that? And then if we say yes, hypothetically, we're just, reasoning this out, the next point would be, okay, for that to be something to do with war, what would that have to look like, and could that happen? I think
it might look a bit like what we're seeing happening right now in Russia. One of the things that's freaked me out just in general is I've been looking, I have been, ever since February 2022, when the whole thing started, I have been like glued to it on like a daily basis. And one of the things that I find really, really shocking is that if you go back to the fall of the Soviet Union, one of the major reasons that the Soviet Union that caused the breakup of that entire empire was specifically the losses in Afghanistan, the Soviet losses in Afghanistan. So the Soviets were in Afghanistan for 10 years. And in that time, they had 15,000 KIA. Now, when I'm saying that, I don't mean casualties. I mean KIA. So you are on the line, you are killed directly while fighting. You aren't shot, and then you go back and you die of your wounds later. That's not a KIA. Similarly, like if you die behind the lines by an accident or whatever, and then obviously that's not including all of the people who have been wounded and rendered unable to work, or at least to continue the war effort. So, I want to differentiate that between that and casualties. So 15,000 KIA in 10 years was a major cause of the breakup of the largest and the second largest and most powerful empire the world has ever seen. Definitely way more powerful, leagues more powerful than the Russian Federation is today. So 15,000 in 10 years breaks that. Now, as I said earlier, back in August of 2023, the casualties, the best estimate that we have for them, I'm sorry, not the casualties, the KIA, killed in action, for just the Russian side was 50,000. So you got to sit there and you got to think. There at this point, it's probably up to around 85, 90,000 KIA, because that's well before Avdiivka. That's well before a number of, incredibly bloody battles. You take 50,000 men and you just yank them out of the economy, and you give them weapons and you send them to die, in Ukraine. Well, there will be consequences for that. Even if Putin won the war tomorrow and got unconditional surrender, took Kyiv, everything, I think, honestly, the Russian state and the Russian Empire, they're going to be haunted by the effects of this war for at least the next century. And what's super disturbing about this whole thing, beyond the economic aspects of it, is the fact that they just keep hitting the pedal harder and harder. Now, how hard can you push the Russian populace? Obviously not infinitely. If we're talking about what happened with the Bolsheviks, they do have a breaking point. But I don't see a breaking point happening anytime soon. I mean, the closest possible thing was the Wagner mutiny, and that was the rest in piss prick goes in. The only people worse than Putin that I can see in charge of Russia is those two assholes. But my point being is that right now we have Russia engaging in mass conscription and treating human lives as more or less worthless, or at least worth infinitely less than a couple of tanks or whatever you want, or whatever field in Ukraine you want to take over. So if we're going to talk about humanity getting to a point where we can't go back to I can see Russia at least doing that for Eastern Europe with regard to conscription. The rest of the world, I don't know. Because the one problem that I can see even with a massive experience, like, for instance, one of the reasons why Europe is more secular today is because of all the religious wars that rocked it. The United States didn't have those. So obviously we tend to be more religious in the United States. So I think there's definitely a level of cultural memory. But the fear here is that, remember, generation after generation, new kids are being born and they don't have the experiences of the previous generation. Now there's culture, obviously, there's formatting of the human hard drive, essentially, in the form of whatever culture you're born into. And, there is history and memory, but our record keeping capabilities so far have not managed to not convince people that war after war after war is a bad thing. There's something very deeply attractive about it to the human id. So I'm not 100% sure. If we're going to see something like that, I can't imagine what it would be, though. If nothing else, I would think that the war in Ukraine would perhaps be the beginning of something like that. I mean, Kurt, you have a different idea.
Well, yeah. So to that point, I think there's a couple reasons. I mean, one is, as far as why people have forgotten, quote, the lessons of say, the dangers of war, right? I mean, one of the things that made America unique for so long was that it had this strong anti-war tradition going back to the colonial period. Mm-hmm. But the military,
George Washington specifically said for us to stay out of, European
entanglements.
Yeah,
right. But the military-industrial complex, which is just another arm of finance capital, has sort of rewritten a lot of that history, so people just aren't aware of it. Or they just weren't even told. Like, you don't have to tell people about it. They just won't find it on their own. That's part of it. But I think the other thing too is, if we have a collapse due to energy shortfalls, then I believe that, however harrowing that would be, could be something like that. When we're talking like something worse than the fall of the Roman Empire, from because we're not only falling from a greater height, we've built a much taller tower than Rome did. The world after is going to be so just devastated due to wars, due to pollution, due to everything. And the resources that we used to build this empire will be gone. Like, it won't go back to like 1800 North America. You still had all this like fertile land and buffalo and everything. It'll be less than that. So I don't know what that would look like. Maybe 10 million people left over. That would be such a cataclysmic experience. I think that it could, I'm not saying it will, but I think it could represent something that would be catalyzing enough.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with you on that. I will point out, so with regard to, for instance, like global warming, which it's been one of the things that I have speculated about what might end the state. I don't remember if I talked with you directly about this. It was either you or maybe it was actually that distributist guy.
Dave, the distributist, maybe it was him because I don't remember that.
Oh yeah, I might have talked about it with him or brought it up like as a point. So what I tend to think about is, in the evolution of the modern nation state, there are a level of military inventions that sort of pushed us from, medieval type warfare into the modern state via absolute monarchy, as Dr. David Friedman famously pointed out to me in a debate. Love that guy, by the way. And Todd, I should say, he's the one that put us in contact with each other.
Well, and I've talked to him before too. He's a real gentleman. Yes. Yeah,
just wonderful guy. Can't stand his father, but I'm not going to hold that against him. He's done the best he could in that situation, and also just like incredibly sweet. So what I was wanting to bring up here specifically is that actually David Friedman knocked it out of my head. What was I about to say, Todd?
I don't even remember.
Oh shit. Okay, then this is what we get for ADHD. It's gotten worse as I've gotten older, folks. All right, so we were talking about in the United States.
You were talking about the collapse of the nation state due to climate change.
Okay, yes, thank you. That got me right back onto it. So the big thing that happened, the big innovation that moved us beyond the era of like castle siege-based warfare was the invention of the cannon. Because suddenly, your ability to protect yourself and to hold territory was no longer dependent on, building these really powerful fortifications that could just be blasted apart by a cannon. So suddenly there became the incentive for the early precursor to the middle, to the modern military industrial complex. If you could conquer a large enough territory and draw taxes from that territory, you could then put that money into the development of weapons like the cannon, and you could use that not just to protect yourself, but to also expand your control. And, as we said before, with, attack more people to take more slaves, to mine more silver, to pay more soldiers, to attack more people to mine more slaves. The same kind of thing starts to happen with regard to post-medieval warfare. And first you then have the rise of, absolute monarchy. And then, probably because it's not a good idea to just give people a position because of who their dad was, then you have the rise of the modern nation state and nationalism. And you'll notice as this has continued, warfare has become worse and more destructive, not less destructive. So I can see, with regard to global warming, what I've always said is that could be the thing that changes it, that changes it because of the massive level of natural disasters, the inability to possibly grow food in regions where you previously could, and everything else that goes along with it. That kind of a huge shift in the environment could make it so that the strategy of pulling a whole bunch of tax money and investing it into professional soldiers and equipping them with the best possible technology becomes, no longer the current meta, as we'll say, is the most effective tactic available. But then also, you can look at the Ukrainians. They're taking out multi-million-dollar tanks with, couple $1,000s worth of, robotics and some old Soviet grenades. So, I don't know if necessarily we will see, at least at first, the collapse of, all war, but we may see the collapse of, for instance, armor-based, maneuver warfare. So here's my question for you, Todd, as we're getting close to the end. And I'm really enjoying this, by the way. I'm really glad you pushed me to do it, because I want to bring you back and we'll talk about the other stuff that we did. By the way, folks, we're going to do, next one is going to be on like Tolkien and magic. And we'll probably also talk, I'll talk a little bit about Alan Moore and his perspective on magic. I think that would be like really fun. Are you up to do that?
No, that'd be great. Yeah. Sure.
Okay. So here's my question for you. We're looking at this and we'll say things go the way that you're supposing that they will in the sense of peak oil. What does the transition between wars as we currently have with the access to the fossil fuels that we have, what then happens, as oil becomes more and more expensive and that type of warfare? Like, what are people going to be doing in the meantime to kill each other? Because homo homini lupus, what are we going to see?
Well, I mean, I do think that as resources become more scarce, they also become more expensive. And so, of course, that will lead to conflict over these resources. But so what I would envision is in the short term, a lot of high intensity conflict. But what happens though, right? You can only employ so much energy, human physical energy and resources into a conflict before it's just no longer sustainable. So at some point after this really terrible time, everybody's going to be so burned out, both physically, they can't, mentally, they just can't do it anymore. And also the resources aren't there. Mm-hmm. And actually, when the population collapses enough, there won't be competition for resources because there'll be so few people left. That's a very dark reading, but that's what I foresee happening is as you continue to, because again, as you mentioned, pay the soldiers, get the slaves, do the mines, pay the soldiers. It's not productive. It doesn't actually build new things. Mm-hmm. In fact, it just destroys things.
Yep.
And so it actually creates this downward spiral where you end up destroying the resources even faster. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, then you have this equilibrium change where now the conflict stops because there's not enough people to fight over the resources anymore, right? It's not that we got more, we just have less people. And so
I'll agree with you 1,000% on that. And as we're kind of coming up on the wire here, by the way, everybody watching, if you're following me, go follow Todd. He's got some very, very interesting discussions. He's a bit more on the right than I am. Granted, I don't like describing myself in terms of the right-left divide because, if I think the left's wrong about something, I'll throw them under the bus in a second. Usually, I think the left has the best ideas, but often the worst people are close to it. So, definitely he's worth listening to you, whether you're more on the right-wing side of things or on the left. It's very interesting to hear what thoughtful people across the aisle think about and believe. So definitely check out his podcast. What I will say is that the thing that people are missing here, and I think it's the thing that Putin is missing, but was ironically proven by COVID. And that is that resources are not just physical things. We all actually have resources in people. One of the only ways to grow the economy in a modern first world nation, because people are not having as many babies as they used to, because most of them aren't dying, is to increase the amount of people that you have within a society. So immigrants, the more people you bring in, be they legal or illegal, your economy will grow because those are all people who can provide labor, and also they provide a market for said labor because everyone needs stuff to keep going. We need society to continue to function as a species. So if you're thinking about, wars like the one that's going on in Ukraine, where we've got, hundreds of thousands of people being killed and even more, displaced, millions displaced, soon to probably be several million more, utterly incapacitated by their wounds. I think what you're going to find is that not only have you hit a point where there's not enough people to fight over the resources, you've also drained a massive reserve of resources that can be found in people's labor. Because ultimately, what is wealth? Wealth is labor plus resources plus intelligence. That's what makes people wealthy. That's what provides a great quality of life. And the danger towards wealth is not the loss of money, because it's just paper. It is the loss of capacity to take those resources, and through your labor and intelligence, turn them into things that make the world a better place. And as you pointed out, wars, conquests, and slavery, they don't do that. They actually make the world a worse place, but then concentrate all the great stuff in fewer and fewer hands, and it doesn't really matter because now those people are in charge. So, Todd, where can people find you, and what are you going to be talking about next on your show?
Yeah, well, again, they can find me on the Praise of Folly podcast. My next discussion, my next show will be on Thursday. How Tolkien's concept of eucatastrophe can help us understand Watership Down. I
love Watership Down and Tolkien. I will definitely be watching.
So just one more thing, Brent. Well, a few final points. First of all, Brenton, I would want to say that with the law of diminishing returns, the longer you do something, eventually the results don't work. Mm-hmm. Part of this thought experiment is based on the idea that violence itself has a diminishing return. Now, it may take a long, long time for that to be hit. It might take thousands or tens of thousands of years. But why would violence be exempt from the principle of diminishing returns? One. Two, you said that the left has the best ideas and the worst people. That's what Emerson said. Emerson said that the liberals, the reformers had the best ideas, but the worst people, and the conservatives had the worst ideas, but the best people. That's what Emerson said.
I find that frequently, with the exception of fascists, because they're the worst of everything.
Well, that didn't exist yet, Brenton. Remember?
No, fair enough.
That was Emerson.
I'm glad. It's funny. I am actually living. I'm not going to say exactly where I'm living. But I will say this. I reached out to my writing partner, Rogue of Cruise Shadows, and I told him where I was. And he immediately was like, oh, my God, because we're staying where we had family. And he declared to me at that point that my wife's grandmother was a transcendentalist. So bring up Emerson, Thoreau, that is very heavily jiving with me at this point. And yeah, I'm a big fan of both. In fact, fun fact, I read Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. It was one of the two things I had to read while I was hiking the Appalachian Trail. It was that, and
I love that book. Oh, sorry, Walden is the one I love. I love Walden.
Walden's great. I wish there were fewer lists in Walden, but yeah, that was the first one that I did. Thoreau, great writer, very nice early anarchist precursor. Definitely everybody should check him out. Okay, so what I'm going to tell everybody real quick before I let you go, because I got to go to a radio interview. You guys see this thing behind me here? So my series, Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, which for several years has been suffering under the creation of my very first graphic novel. This is Snow White Zombie Apocalypse Volume 1. Which begins, I should add, with an excerpt from the poem Fairy Reel by Neil Gaiman. Neil gave me his personal permission to use this, so he's technically guys like the platonic ideal of a writer. He is technically a collaborator on my first book. Ron Martz wrote the foreword. Ron being the writer of Green Lantern and Silver Surfer, as well as Marvel versus DC. He's a huge mentor of mine. The art in this thing is freaking phenomenal. It's by Hyando Park of Dark Horse, and we have a Ringo nomination. We have two, but one for his inking style. And then we also have Luana Vecchio of Image, who immediately after she finished her work on my series won a frickin' Eisner, which if you don't know what that is, it's like the Oscars for comics. Immediately after working with me. Is it because she worked with me? No, but you know what? I'm going to say definitely yes. We have the next artist taking it up, and it's one behind me here. This is Adam Bryce Thomas of IDW's Sonic the Hedgehog and Samurai Jack. And if you're noticing some stuff in like the hair and kind of the inking style, yes, he is pulling from Berserk, and oh my God, it is like grim and frostbitten, and I can't even. So we just broke 10,000 on our way to 12. We got 15 days left. If you guys want to get a badass comic book, and get in on this, I highly recommend it. I'm putting the thing into the chat there. And look for Todd to be back on the show very soon, because I am really excited to talk with him about magic as I get a little older and slowly like morph myself into a wizard without telling anyone I'm a wizard. Now, so Todd, did you have anything else to plug?
No, that was it. It was great, Brenton. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for, letting me go on. This has been a really long time since I have streamed, and dude, thank you for getting me back on the internet, because I now I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh my God, why did I stop doing this? All right, well, I'll catch you guys later, and keep an eye on this. Follow Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, and catch you later.
See ya.